The views and opinions expressed on any program are those of the producers and/or the persons appearing on the program, and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of FRC Media, Bristol Community College, or the City of Fall River.
Welcome to FRC Media. I'm Keith Teba. I want to thank those of you who followed our presidential series. We started, I believe, back in June, talking about the presidential election, right through the two party conventions, and then we led close to the debates, and then up to the election time. This is going to be our last interview in our presidential series, and we actually have a lot to talk about because we haven't spoken to our guests since before the election. So we've had an election, we're getting close to the inauguration, so we thought it'd be a good time to bring in Don Kilguss, the Associate Professor of History and Government here at Bristol Community College. Don, how are you? Happy New Year.
Good, thank you. Happy New Year to you. Thank you for having me.
So there's actually a lot we want to talk about. Some we'll talk a little bit more in depth than not, but I want to get your feelings following the election and the election of now President-elect Trump, as he's going to be heading into a second term. There's a lot of postmortems about what happened. Have you had the opportunity to delve into some of those issues? And what are your thoughts from the election?
Well, I think when we look at the election, I think there are a lot of questions. I mean, this was such an interesting campaign. It was a long and winding road, to quote the Beatles, if you will, from everything that happened with the debates in June all the way through the conventions and everything, as you mentioned. And I just wonder if the Democrats, if they had a do-over, basically, if they would look at things a little bit differently, maybe try to, either set up a accelerated kind of primary process to maybe perhaps choose a different candidate. Maybe they would have stuck with Vice President Harris. Maybe they would have kept her in that second spot and chosen someone else for the presidential spot going forward. Maybe they would have thought about maybe coming if things had been a little bit different about President Biden's health and his some of the issues that he's been dealing with. If they had dealt with them a little bit sooner, maybe that would have been something as well that maybe they have a little regrets about, perhaps, or something. I think when we look at the election as well, were the pollsters being told exactly what people thought in terms of who they were actually going to vote for example? Were the public a little misleading, or didn't feel they could express themselves to the pollsters exactly honestly for one reason or another, whatever reason that might be? So it'll be interesting to see long-term too, what, as we look at any inauguration, you always look ahead, but you always first look back. And you think about President Biden. What is his legacy going to be long-term? Obviously, he did pardon his son on December 1st, Hunter. So what is that going to have an impact going forward? I mean, I think most of us, when you and I were talking earlier in the summer, I said that's going to happen. One way or another is going to happen, and it did. So I don't think I was unique in believing that was going to happen going forward, despite assurances from the White House that wasn't going to happen. So will that have an impact on the legacy? I think what is always troubling for me sometimes is in this day and age with social media and everything else, we need this instant gratification. Was President Biden a great president? Was he a good president? Was he a subpar president? And I think in the past, historians have always purposely waited to kind of judge and to rank presidents because it's that recent bias almost that we have, I think, can influence the ratings, because we always see presidential ratings change over the years as circumstances change, as policies that go into effect today, really we can't see their impact for 4, 5, 6, 10 years, maybe in some cases. So if that's the case, how can we really say, oh, this person was great here or wasn't as great in this area of his presidency? I think as we look forward to a new president coming in with the inauguration with President Trump, it's interesting that President Trump is going to be the second person to serve 2 non-consecutive terms in office, the first being Grover Cleveland back in the late 1800s. He's going to be the first person who was convicted of a felony to serve as president. And he's also going to be the first person who was impeached as he was impeached during his first term to actually be elected president as well. Now, of course, he wasn't elected immediately after the impeachment, after his first term ended. We had that 4 years in between. So I think this is a very unique environment in which we're living right now. And it'll be interesting to see where things go moving forward in so many ways, and how I think historians will look as well and say, okay, what did not President-elect Trump do during the campaign to attract that kind of voters, those that coalition, if you will, that I know the Republicans are talking about, of individuals to put him over the top in the not just the electoral vote this time, but in both the electoral and the popular vote this time.
And I was going to ask you about now President Trump getting back to a second term. You already talked about the history about it, but getting back briefly back to the election, there was so much talk on the left and by a lot of news organizations about President Trump's baggage, right? You talked about the lawsuits and his court appearances and the two impeachments. But when it came down to it, people overlooked that because they were more concerned about, I guess, what you call the kitchen table issues, right? The economy, cost of living.
Right.
And it appears that, the Democrats may have lost track of that into the election. Do you agree with that?
I think that's something that we definitely have to look at. Absolutely. I think those bread and butter issues, kitchen table issues, however you want to describe them, whether it be inflation, cost of living in general, I think those are things that really impacted many people's vote in this election. I think also when you look at it, I think from the Democratic perspective as well, I think Vice President Harris had a very difficult time in trying to, and I don't mean this in a negative sense, but to distance herself from Biden and his presidency. And I'm not saying distance themselves in a negative sense at all, but to kind of carve out and say, okay, how would she be different than President Biden if people think she needed to be different? And I think that's where the Democrats had to struggle as well. I think they had to say that, okay, well, the last 4 years we've accomplished X, Y, and Z, but then the American public and the American voters were saying, well, wait a minute, I'm concerned about these issues, A, B, and Z. And you're saying you're going to, attack this when you become president. Well, you've had the last 4 years as vice president and with Biden as president. Why didn't you address these issues satisfactorily over the last 4 years? So I think that becomes an issue as well. And I think President Trump had the luxury, if you will, to be able to run by saying, well, when I was there for, 8 years ago, 7 years ago, things were better in this way or that way, and make that kind of contrast with the Biden presidency, which through association meant the Harris vice presidency. So I think in all those ways, I think it was very challenging for her on that way. I think from President Trump's perspective, trying to say that, okay, we're not necessarily going to go back to the good old days. I don't mean it that way, but to try and say that, okay, well, my 4-year term was better economically and I can help you in these areas. And I think that message resonated, as you mentioned, I think more so with the voters. And I think that had a huge impact in helping to create and bring together that, as we said, that coalition that some people have discussed. And also, I can't also underestimate perhaps the impact of the confusion within the Democrats with President Biden withdrawing, and then what's going to happen with the primaries. Was everyone really as happy with Vice President Harris going forward? She was also never able to distance herself from what she had said in the primaries when she, in the run-up to the first primaries. I don't think she ever really actually made it to the first primaries for the Democrats back in 2020.
Right. That was back in 2020, correct? Yeah.
Right, but she never was really able to get to distance and say, okay, well, how can I do it? And that's the tough thing, because when you look at Democrats and Republicans, when they're running for office, they're always much more liberal if you're a Democrat, conservative if you're a Republican, up until and through the primaries. And then you use that time after the primaries and when you've cinched it, to kind of become, okay, get back more to the center. She never had that opportunity to do that either. And I think that's something. And also, okay, maybe the assassination attempt plus on former President Trump, how much could that have played into things as well? I mean, I think there's just a number of different things that kind of play into this that I think are really fascinating to think about.
And it'll be left to the historians like yourself to talk about and try to find an answer that people will accept. All right, I want to move on from the election and just talk about what else has happened between then and the upcoming inauguration. The states certified their election results in early to mid-December, sent the electoral votes into Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Those votes were officially counted. And I guess, thankfully, unlike 4 years ago, it was a relatively simple process where all the states' numbers were calculated and tallied, and Vice President checked that President-elect Trump was officially elected as President of the United States. And for a lot of people who remembered what happened 4 years ago on January 6th, this was a different situation on January 6th, 2025.
Absolutely. It was a much different situation. It was much more reasonable and logical, and just the steps were taken that were necessary as laid out in the Constitution and subsequent legislation that's been passed over the years. And I think it's a testament to the American democracy, the American spirit, the adherence we have to the U.S. Constitution as well. So that is really the last step in the election process, where we have, there are many steps in the process, obviously, as we know, beginning with the primaries that seem to have started after this last election, November, ended. Already looking at the next one coming up here in 2028. We also had, obviously, that when the American public actually went to vote in November, when the electors met, as you mentioned, in December. Now, when Vice President Harris, they officially counted the votes and proclaimed, obviously, who the new president and vice president were. And now we have, in a couple of weeks coming up, the inauguration, where the Constitution was really silent on the inauguration and all these new festivities that I know that we're going to get into here in a couple minutes. But they did say in the Constitution, the only one thing they really did stipulate is that the new president will swear or affirm an oath. And they actually spelled out the oath for the president in the Constitution itself, in Article 2 of the Constitution. And that's what we'll see. But again, like many things in our government, that has evolved over the centuries. So it's a much, much bigger production than what it was when George Washington was inaugurated the first time in April of 1789.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about that. How has it evolved? Obviously, you said in that that first inauguration, what we see today really has evolved over the years, and a lot of it has to do in most recent times, I believe, except for one inauguration, that the Supreme Court Chief Justice is involved. So I guess talk a little bit about how things have evolved in terms of our inauguration.
Well, as I mentioned a second ago, the inaugural festivities themselves were not mentioned in the Constitution. The only thing that was that the president shall swear or affirm. Swearing ties in, obviously, the religious and connotations, whereas the affirming is more of just the legal, like you would do going into a court of law. And only one president officially has affirmed, and that was Franklin Pierce back in 1853. He had lost his son just before coming down to Washington, D.C., and his wife believed that was a sign from God that to remove all of distractions from the president during his term. So she really encouraged him, and he did as well. They were both distraught for obvious reasons, losing their last child. They lost the other two children as young children as well. This child died at the age of 12, and he affirmed as opposed to swearing in terms of the oath. We also see that the Constitution was silent about who actually should swear in a president-elect. Today, it is customary, as you mentioned, that the Chief Justice does it, and they have done it for almost every president-elect coming into office. The exceptions were, as you mentioned, George Washington for the first inauguration, and there's a good reason for that, because in 1789, there was no Supreme Court. There was no federal court system. So that was the exception. So it was actually the highest judge in the New York state system, because George Washington was sworn in actually in New York City, which was the then temporary capital of the United States in 1789. In his second inaugural, he will actually be, the oath of office will be administered by an associate justice of the Supreme Court, not the Chief Justice, but the associate justice actually had that circuit. Each justice of the Supreme Court has a circuit that they're responsible for in the United States. And the justice who swore in Washington had the responsibility for Philadelphia, which that was then the temporary capital of the United States, when he was sworn in 1793, as they were building the permanent capital of the United States in the District of Columbia. So those are a couple interesting little things in terms of who should administer it. They also were silent about the date, about when actually the president should be inaugurated. March 4th was originally spelled out in the Presidential Succession Act of 1792, which stated that would be the day for the inauguration. Again, by the way, these all are contingent on the day of the week as well. If March 4th was a Sunday, they would push it off to the 5th. And usually if it was falling on a Sunday, a president would be sworn in privately by usually the Chief Justice, and then they would have a public ceremony the following day. So, and that remained the case as March 4th was the inauguration day, right up until 1933. And with the ratification of the 20th Amendment in 1933, what they did is that they moved the inauguration day from March 4th up until January 20th or the 21st, again, if the 20th happened to be on a Sunday. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward, and that is we don't need as much time anymore. From the election day when you and I go out to vote in November, we didn't need 4 or 5, almost 6 months until March 4th in order for the inauguration to take place. We have some of these pressing issues. We had, for example, the beginning of the Civil War back in the 1860-61 timeframe, where Lincoln couldn't be sworn in until March 4th, and that was a critical time period. We also had, as we looked at 1933 itself, we have Franklin Delano Roosevelt going to be sworn in during the height of the Great Depression. So people looked at it and said, we really don't need this length of time any longer with modern transportation and communication and everything else. We don't need that. So it also reduces that kind of that lame duck session for Congress, where the former Congress is still sitting until the new president and the new Congress comes in. Because the 20th Amendment not only moved up Inauguration Day from March 4th to January 20th, but also stipulated that the new Congress would begin meeting on January 3rd. So that means that the new Congress could then count the electoral votes on January 6th. And if there happened to be a problem, any kind of discrepancy, someone were not receiving a majority of the electoral vote, for example, it would be the newly elected members of Congress from that point forward who would decide who the new president and vice president would be. It wouldn't be the old Congress, many of whom may have been voted out of office or been thinking about actually retiring. And finally, the location always becomes a big issue. Whereas I mentioned, previously, the only president-elects that have been sworn in outside of the District of Columbia was George Washington in New York City and obviously in Philadelphia. And they've all been sworn in the Capitol itself. Now, whether that's inside the House chamber, Senate chamber, right outside the House or Senate chamber in terms of, being outside in the fresh air with the public. The only exception to that rule was actually when it occurred after the War of 1812. When the Capitol had been destroyed and they were trying to repair the damage from the British invasion during the War of 1812, the president and vice president were sworn in, and just behind there, currently where the Supreme Court building is, if you're familiar with DC and the geography, what was called the Old Brick Capitol was actually the temporary capital at the time. So Monroe was sworn in there with his VP in 1817, which is interesting.
Yeah. And now it's really an event, a pomp and circumstance event. When did the inaugurations that we see now, I'm sure again that's evolved. When did it really become more of an event that, is structured around, at noontime, right? The president needs to be sworn in at noontime, and then the vice president before that. I mean, when has what we currently see, when has that been sort of the norm?
Well, much of that, as I said, has evolved over time in terms of the inaugural balls, in terms of having, the parades, or having even playing music like Hail to the Chief, or having the incoming president go greet the outgoing president at the White House, for example. All these things evolved gradually over time. There was no real imperative that it had to happen that way, for example. It's just kind of tradition and custom. It just evolved. However, when some of the things that you had mentioned about, noon, for example, on March 4th, or noon on January 20th, for example, all of that was found in that different legislation about the Presidential Succession Act, the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, or other kind of supporting documentation that states it's easiest to say that the outgoing Congress or the outgoing president's term ends at 11:59 a.m. and the new president's term begins at noon, and so on and so forth. So they just did that in the purposes of that different legislation to kind of create that kind of uniformity for the system, which again, as you and I have talked about throughout this whole series that we've done, we didn't even have a national election day per se until 1845. So this has all been evolving over the centuries, and what we see now, if we could bring back George Washington or John Adams or any of the other, Thomas Jefferson, they would look at this, and other than the inaugural address, they would probably be pretty shocked in terms of the pomp and the circumstance and things. I mean, George Washington originally, when he was going to be sworn in for the second term, actually reached out to his cabinet and asked the four cabinet members, what should this be? This oath of office I take, should it be done privately? Should it be done publicly? Should the public be, there? Should we have some kind of role for the American people in it, and so on and so forth? And eventually, that's kind of that's what they decided, and that's where it's gone, and it's evolved, exponentially, since then, to include not just the oath of office, but the inaugural address, different prayers, poems, the congressional luncheon that will occur right after the inaugural, for example, the parade at the White House, different prayer services, all the different balls, and all the different kinds of, presidential coins or other kinds of things that were struck and will be struck to commemorate this event and things like that. So it has just taken on a whole life of its own. So it's difficult to say necessarily, although I have examples of when this occurred for the first time or that occurred for the first time. And it's interesting to see how that evolution, because it shows the evolution of our government.
One of the things, and prior to our interview, you always send some very detailed notes, which I appreciate. And being, a history buff myself, there were some things that I didn't realize. Like, one of the things that is talked about after a presidential election, when there's a new president coming in, is the transition, the peaceful transfer of power. And I was under the impression, falsely so, and I want you to talk about it, that a lot of times the incoming president is welcomed by, the outgoing president, and then they both ride to the Capitol. And I was under the impression that 4 years ago, when Joe Biden was sworn into office, President Trump did not attend. I was under the impression that the former presidents attended. That's not the case. President Trump is not the only president to not attend his successor's inauguration. Talk about that.
No, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. I mean, we have multiple examples of presidents elects who, or rather, the outgoing presidents who have decided not to actually attend the inauguration of their successors for a number of different reasons. President Trump, as you mentioned, was the person who 4 years ago chose not to, because he was still contesting, obviously, the election and the election results. He was not the first person to do that, as you said. He was actually the fifth person to actually do that. The first person actually not to attend was actually John Adams. And again, this became a custom. This became a tradition. George Washington, like he did with everything, created a tradition and a precedent for so many things in America that we still see today. And he attended the inauguration of his successor, John Adams, in 1797. So that became the tradition that you attend your successor's inauguration. Well, in 1800, Thomas Jefferson was elected president in a disputed election. And this was going to be the first peaceful transition of power, as you just mentioned, between two rival political parties that really saw the world very differently. They all agreed on what they want. They want America to be healthy and prosperous and so on and so forth. However, they differ on how do you get there. So the Federalist Party, which John Adams was a member of, and Thomas Jefferson, who was the leader of the Jeffersonian Republicans or the Democratic Republicans, they had different views on how government should act, how the role of the president, Congress, virtually anything, foreign policy. So when Jefferson was elected in this disputed election, there were some fears, genuine fears, about what might happen. And therefore, John Adams decided that he wasn't going to stick around Washington. He hopped the first carriage out of D.C., and he was on his way back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, when Jefferson was taking the oath of office, for example. We see, for example, as well, that it will actually be John Adams's son, John Quincy Adams, who didn't attend the inauguration of his successor, which was Andrew Jackson at the time. So we have seen that happen periodically. We also saw that Nixon did not attend the inauguration of his successor. Now, again, Richard Nixon, that was a completely different kind of strange phenomena there in terms of, the early 1970s and what America was going through with the Watergate scandal and Nixon resigning and everything else. And the other president who did not attend was actually Andrew Johnson in 1869. He did not attend. He had been the first president to have been impeached, had a let's just say, very challenging presidency, didn't really see eye to eye at all with the members of Congress and the Republicans who controlled Congress, for example, at that time. So it was very interesting that he chose not to attend either. And something else that kind of goes off is an offshoot of this, as you were kind of getting at as well, is that traditionally the incoming president will go to meet the outgoing president at the White House. In the 19th century, it was referred to as the executive mansion. And they would go and greet that person. And in 1837, when Van Buren, who had served as Jackson's vice president, he paid a visit to the White House to meet Jackson on Inauguration Day, and they both rode in the carriage to the Capitol for Van Buren's inauguration. And Jackson sat in the right seat as they were coming in the carriage. Now, as you and I would look at it, he'd be off to the left, but he'd be sitting in the carriage on the right-hand side, and Van Buren sat on the left, obviously. Well, when they left the inaugural, Van Buren sat in the right-hand side of the seat. And that has become now customary. I mean, if you think back to the very famous photograph of Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt as they're going from the White House to the inauguration, you see the very glum Hoover sitting in the right-hand seat, and you see FDR sitting to the left, looking very confident that this Great Depression will be something that we can defeat as a nation together.
Yeah, very, very interesting stuff. I just want to leave with some facts, excuse me, that you've provided in terms of, oldest presidents when they've been inaugurated, youngest president. Actually, the current oldest president to be inaugurated is Joe Biden. That's going to change in a few days. So talk about some of those fun facts that we can leave with today.
Okay, great. Yeah, I mean, the oldest person ever inaugurated president was Joe Biden, and if everything goes according to plan, in January 20th, the new oldest person ever to be inaugurated will be Donald Trump. The youngest person ever to be inaugurated president was someone that I think many people know was John Fitzgerald Kennedy. However, what always tends to kind of catch people is he was not the youngest person to ever serve as president. That person was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was about a year younger when he became president upon the assassination of William McKinley. Interestingly enough, the youngest vice president in American history was John C. Breckinridge, a little bit over 36 years of age. And J.D. Vance, who is going to be sworn in again in a couple of weeks, as we mentioned, will be actually the third youngest. The Breckinridge was the youngest. Nixon was actually the second youngest, and now J.D. Vance will be the third youngest to actually serve. The oldest vice president to ever be inaugurated was Alben Barkley back in 1949. He was over 71 years of age. So it's interesting to see some of these different little things that we see coming in terms of the little trivia that we see for every presidential inauguration. There's always a little twist, a little turn that makes each inauguration, like every campaign, unique to the individuals that are involved. Now, whether we see this year Donald Trump going to the White House and then riding in that car ride over from the White House, we'll see if that happens again. I remember back in 2017, he met President Obama at the White House and things. Obviously, it didn't happen 4 years ago, so we'll see how that works out. We'll see also what happens going forward with any other kinds of little anecdotes or little things that we glean from the inauguration. Hopefully, again, as the oldest person, Donald Trump, going to be giving his inauguration. One of the other pieces of trivia I sent to you that I just want to mention is there's also something to be said about brevity for inaugural addresses, because the person who delivered the longest inaugural address was at that time the oldest person ever inaugurated. That was William Henry Harrison in 1841. He delivered an over 4,000 word speech, about almost an hour and 20 minutes, hour and a half or something it took. He was out there in a blistery cold wind with only his top coat on. He didn't have with only his suit on, excuse me. He didn't have a top coat, didn't have a top hat, anything else. He subsequently caught cold, which eventually turned into pneumonia. And on April 4th, he died. That was actually the shortest presidential term in American history, about literally 1 month. So brevity has its advantages and many things in life.
Keep the speech short, right?
As well. Yes, just keep it to the point and keep moving.
Yeah. Well, Don, I really do appreciate your help with us throughout this time period. I'm sure we'll be back in touch when things may happen that we need a historical perspective. We'll definitely call on you. I appreciate your time and all the best.
Well, that'd be great. I really appreciate it. And thank you. And I hope people have enjoyed it.
All right. And thank you for joining us here in FRC Media. I'm Keith Tebow. Have a great day.